Thank you very much. I'm Hamish Maxwell-Stewart. So I used to be with the University of Tasmania. I am about to be appointed to staff at the University of New England. So this is my first time in Port Macquarie, but I'm very much hoping that it's not going to be my last. It's my privilege to chair this first session. So the first two speakers that we will have will actually be Tamsin and myself. And I need to give a little bit of background introduction. So Tamsin and I met a very long time ago at the University of Edinburgh, where we were both students. And the person who taught us, or one of the people who taught us history, was the late Ian Duffield, who was just an inspirational teacher and somebody who loved this part of the world very, very much. And Ian convinced me not to do a PhD on the Atlantic slave trade, but instead to do my PhD on convict transportation to Australia. So Ian is responsible for me moving myself across the world to Australia. Now, Ian unfortunately died in 2019, and he left a whole archive of papers. And in there was a very long paper about a bushranger outbreak at Port Macquarie. Now, what Tamsin has done is go through that paper and reduce it down, distill out all of the kind of really, really insightful insights. Tamsin is going to read the first half of that paper, and then I'm going to take over from her. So over to you, Tamsin.
Well, it's an absolute delight to be here today. We've survived plague, we've survived flood, and the locusts have not yet arrived.
Well, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the First Nations people as the traditional owners of all the lands on which we gather today, and of course, of which we speak. We pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging. And thank you all for joining us here today in the room and on Zoom. Don't forget to mute, but use chat for questions and comments. Judging by his footnotes, Ian started this paper in the early 2000s, and this morning we are sharing an edited version of his unfinished manuscript concerning the mass convict outbreak, one of the largest and least known in penal station history. I'll nod to you. Oh, it's there. There's that. Okay, can you sit there, Clive, and be my person?
No, I might have to.
We've just got a technical moment, have we? Right, thank you. I'm going to keep Clive right there to press the buttons. On the 30th of June, 1825, the Sydney Gazette published a letter from a public servant concerning a convict outbreak at Port Macquarie Penal Station, dated the 30th of June, 1825. The opening sentence doubtless captured Ian's attention as he scrolled through the microfilm in those laborious days before Trove and a keyword search. The notorious Goth, one of the most incorrigible characters that ever infested society, ran into the bush. The letter continues in similar vein and had been written shortly after the last sparks of rebellion were extinguished. The nom de plume suggests it was the work of a civil officer on the station. Amongst Ian's pre-digital research notes, I found this observation, and from the evidence we have, it is not an unreasonable supposition. Regardless, our anonymous public servant reports that on the 1st of June, a band of 5 escaped prisoners, all capital respites and led by one Captain Brown, had ambushed a soldier and a convict constable at the sugar plantation, tying him up and making off with the soldier's musket. The title of captain was likely bestowed upon John Brown by his fellow convicts, who doubtless admired his dash. It is familiar to us as part of the traditional nomenclature of highwaymen and bushrangers, Captain McKeith, Captain Starlight, Captain Thunderbolt, and so on. A subversive courtesy title to be sure, but one that was never bestowed lightly. Captain Brown must have been a man to reckon with. Indeed, over the next few days, over 30 prisoners were prepared to follow him, not only into the bush, but into a head-on battle with their jailers. Naturally, a public servant did not subscribe to subversive hero worship, and instead damned the so-called Captain Brown as just another infamous character, the contemptible consort to the equally notorious and detestable Gough. Ian's old friend, Black John Gough. More on him later. In such contexts, a word or phrase, such as that militaristic captain, could be loaded with quite different meanings, depending on the perspectives and power relations in play. Men such as a public servant, who so assiduously defended the often unstable power relations of early New South Wales, were the very same men who constructed and compiled the printed sources concerning convict resistance. Thus, the language and actions of the convict is necessarily channeled through hostile sources. Under such circumstances, suggests Ian, it requires an archaeology of convict resistance, culture to discern what may have been meant by the convicts themselves. Accordingly, he sets out to sift through the layers of meaning attached to the outbreak, and he also attempts to construct an etymology of the associated language. Characteristically, no stone is left unturned, no nuance is left unacknowledged. A public servant's account suggests that Brown's ambush was the prearranged signal for the mass escapes the following day, which were led by John Gough. Two serious bushranging raids in rapid sequence were mounted on Prospect, the isolated and poorly defended residence of T.A. Scott, the superintendent of the sugar plantation. The escaped convicts were, of course, after supplies, but Scott would have been an obvious target for convict resentment. Indeed, earlier that year, Commandant Gilman trenchantly observed in a letter to Scott, there appears to be a total want of comfort and arrangement in the messing of your men, and in some instances they have not received the quantity of rations issued from the commissariat for their use. Regardless of Scott's shortcomings, and they were legion, the prisoners' reprisals could not go unchallenged. Accordingly, Gilman acted very quickly, deploying various combinations of indigenous trackers, troops, trusted convict constables, and appropriate civil officers. The scattered bands of escaped convicts were thus prevented from coalescing into a single force. They were so effectively thwarted that in a little over a week, 2 were dead, including Captain Brown, and 1 was wounded, and most of the others had been rounded up. Ian poses 2 questions. How then do we characterise the Port Macquarie outbreak? Was it, as Commandant Gilman reported, nothing but a small brush fire, and therefore was it, as subsequent historians have tacitly implied, something marginal and forgettable? You can probably anticipate the rough direction of Ian's answers, but let us address the first of those questions. Despite the pragmatic downplay of language in the immediate aftermath, the rising had been taken very seriously by both sides. First, the convicts did not simply bolt for freedom. They had remained on the fringes of the settlement and on the offensive. This was a worrying departure from the usual habits of runaways, as was the number of escapees involved. 32 men joined the outbreak, far in excess of the usual runaway parties that consisted of a handful at most. The scale of the subsequent trials of the surviving ringleaders, all on capital charges, is testament to the official view. Death was recorded in each case. To view such an outbreak as insignificant, insists Ian, improperly dismisses the intense experiential effects felt at the time. Significantly, those convicts who would be held most responsible, John Gough, Thomas Brooks, and John Banks, all shared extensive experience of challenging the penal station system head-on, the sort of collective experience that the authorities dreaded. Moreover, the stakes were high. T.A. Scott had been humiliated and put in fear of his life, while Captain Gilman's reputation and career had been placed at risk. Many of the uninvolved convicts became unsettled and difficult to manage. During this period, colonial authority often perceived itself as fragile believed that bushranging as a phenomenon was capable of precipitating wider insurrection. Interestingly, 1825 was a peak period of this anxiety. The British had never really recovered from the shock of the French Revolution. Of course, in retrospect, it is evident that the convict bushranging lacked the potential the government so feared. Port Macquarie, newly created in 1821, as we well know, was of course deliberately cited, like all new penal stations, to be remote from other settlements. Its prisoner population was estimated at 1,600 in December 1825. The original garrison numbered 39 troops and 59 convicts. By 1825, the garrison had been modestly augmented, but by no means pro rata to the hugely increased convict population. The regimental guard was stretched very thin. During an outbreak such as this, focused as it was on the remote outstations of the settlement, the need to defend headquarters further limited the troops available for aggressive patrols. A major fear of the civil and military officers was that the 30 men who had already risen might ignite wider rebellion at the heart of the settlement. And what is more, when the Irishman Michael Clancy led the Ring leaders in a cry for death or liberty, such fears can only have intensified. For those words historicised and politicised the outbreak for everyone on the settlement, convicts and officers alike. I think what I do. As Paula Jane Byrne wrote of bushrangers, they were conscious of being engaged in an activity which had a past, and one which they naturally hoped, but did not expect, would deliver a future. A notion that has particular force in the context of June 1825, for implicit in this rebel cry was an understanding that liberty could so easily collapse into death. From the mouths of the out-and-outers who led the outbreak, and for those there was unassailable evidence of capital offences, the cry, death or liberty, seemed self-evidently apt, not to mention dangerously self-fulfilling. Escape from a penal station was difficult enough, but adding a charge of banditry against government property and personnel was akin to a forlorn hope, a suicide mission. Indeed, in this starkly declared dichotomy of defiance, death was always the most likely outcome. As Byrne points out, what lay in giving oneself up was the threat of a death sentence. Ian takes this further by pointing out that not surrendering also carried the threat of violent death in the bush. Even those who evaded the military muskets or the indigenous spears of furious pursuit could simply die of privation and starvation in an unknown and unforgiving landscape. As the runaways well knew, surrender could deliver life, but it may be one they judged worse than death. An existence entailing what Orlando Patterson, the historian of slavery, termed social death. What is more, heavy floggings and long sentences to brutal gang work at Macquarie Harbour or Moreton Bay were for some a fate worth dying to escape from. Oh, I missed one. Sorry. I missed a couple. Oh. I do this.
So which do you want to go back or forward?
We should be on 11.
Oh, I can't see a number.
Sorry.
Which is? We've got the skirmish.
Yeah.
Augustus Earl.
Yeah, I think it'll be the one after the map.
That's
oh, no, it's not that. Go back. Sorry. It's fine. Absolutely. The isolated siting of a penal station was, of course, penally functional. Boundless seeming tracts of, that's the right one, of surrounding bush were intended to deter or thwart would-be bolters. Care was taken to publish the perils of flight. In August 1816, the official Sydney Gazette warned the would-be runaways of Newcastle that the native hordes of the Hunter River and northwards were in league to destroy every white person that may unhappily fall into their power. This, of course, was demonstrably untrue. Relations between indigenous tribes and escaped convicts were far more complex than the Gazette's strategic scaremongering would allow. For every speared Newcastle convict, scores more made it safely across the Hawkesbury. While later to the north at Moreton Bay, some runaway convicts were absorbed into the family and cultural life of Indigenous tribes, including one of our surviving leaders, John Banks, who lived with the butler at Wide Bay for 14 years before being killed by white vigilantes on a spree to shoot blacks. Quick transition.
Meanwhile, in Port Macquarie, an earlier group escaped in February 1825 further illustrates the perils of bolting. On the 2nd of February, 6 convicts at the stockyards jumped a constable while he was issuing rations. They dragged him into the bush and gave him a severe thrashing before taking off with the said rations. Such revenge attacks against overseers and constables were common. Gilman's response is instructive. He sent 2 armed soldiers and a native bush constable in pursuit, possibly Bob Barrett, the meritorious and useful native constable who, according to our public servant, was put upon the track of the villains during the June outbreak. A couple of troops in the tracker may appear a feeble sortie against 6 desperate men, but Gilman knew his business. The tracking skills of a single native constable and the firepower of 2 regular soldiers was a lethal enough combination. The tracker quickly located their quarry, and the soldiers called upon the unarmed convicts to surrender. They fled the cover, and the soldiers opened fire, killing 1 and severely wounding another. Presumably, the tracker had stealthily guided the soldiers into close enough range for effective musketry. Given the complicated reloading procedure after each shot, there was only one opportunity to let off a volley, but with the tracker performing almost as accurately as a gun sight, this was enough to take out 1/3 of the escape party, well illustrating the deadly effects of small-scale tracker plus troop operations against convict absconders. It is typical of Ian not to merely accept the role of the native tracker, but to examine it forensically and to scrupulously observe in his footnotes that similar tactics were used in the British Army in attacks against Aboriginal people. But in such instances, the trackers were necessarily drawn from areas remote to those under attack. And the next image. Which might explain the intriguing fragment in the Sydney Monitor dated May 1830. Bob Barrett, the Aboriginal black, and his people returned to Port Macquarie, government having set aside the expedition to Van Diemen's Land. There are no further details about how or why they were to be deployed, be it against bushrangers or in the Black War, which of course was raging in Van Diemen's Land at that time. But Barrett is still living up to his useful and meritorious reputation. The Commandant's correspondence on the matter leaves us in no doubt about either Barrett's military capabilities or the military intentions of the authority. Here we learn that Captain Robert Barrett, commanding a detachment of Port Macquarie native volunteers, unlike the references to Captain Brown, there is no sneering satire apparent in the Commandant's designations. Indeed, his matter-of-fact tone suggests that he considered their military credentials a settled and uncontroversial proposition. The regimental troops at Port Macquarie were, of course, executing binding military orders, but nevertheless, both they and the convict constables were further incentivised by significant cash rewards for the apprehension of runaways. With no less than 32 men at large in June 1825, the potential earnings for convict deaths and captures was really substantial, £5 per head. So that's an incredible amount of money in 19th century terms. It is no wonder that one of Tamsin's petitioners, Tamsin will talk about later, wrote to the Colonial Secretary requesting a post at one of the outstations. So Matthias Mayer, who was serving as a constable at Parramatta, assured the Colonial Secretary that he could barely keep out of debt as, quote, very few bushrangers passed through the town of Parramatta. But what motivated Ian in his exploration of the beer pipe trackers? Superficially, it was also, he thought, a transactional issue. Items such as fishing tackles, hatchets, slop clothing and blankets were the common currency, and on occasion even alcohol and cash payments were made. However, the trackers were not merely useful experts whose skills could be cheaply bought with commissariat consumables. In these early years, the eager pursuit of convict bolters was also motivated by the need to contain the settlement and protect their people and lands from the careless and ruthless incursions of desperate runaways, some of whom were even equipped with kangaroo dogs. Ian explains all of this in much more detail, but I think John may cover some of this in his speech, his talk this afternoon. All these perils, plus the natural hazards of the surrounding bush, would seem to adequately explain why that cry for death or liberty was so apt in June 1825. Nevertheless, convict apprehension of the manifold dangers of escape is not the whole story. Death or liberty, and its more optimistic variant, liberty or death, was a recurrent slogan of overt popular resistance in Ireland, Australia, next slide. The convict rebel Philip Cunningham famously raised the cry on the 4th of March 1805 at the start of the Castle Hill Rising. In the most literal sense, Cunningham died for death or liberty, but his followers took up as a defiant and persistent cry, and those who escaped the gallows constituted the founding prisoner population of Newcastle, the first penal station. Colonial memories of these events lingered, and death or liberty became part of the hidden transcript of subversive or convict oral culture to be summoned at those rare moments when established power relations could be openly challenged. As Ian notes of some historians, both this oral culture and the tendency to challenge authority is regarded as almost exclusively Irish. Ian, ever suspicious of any brand of exclusivity, sets out to unravel these claims, pointing out that many English convicts belong to rough, turbulent urban cultures, in which not only native-born English, but also Irish, blacks, Lascars, Jews, and foreigners of all sorts combined to challenge their economic and social superiors head-on. And it is these combinations that interest Ian as he leads us on a complex journey of death or liberty outbreaks. So, next slide. From the delivery of Newgate to the naval mutinies at Spithead in the Nore and onwards to the Cato Street conspiracy of 1820. We must necessarily skimp the details, but he is at pains to demonstrate how plebeians of different national backgrounds, even English and Irish, could on occasion unite in a common cause against hated authority, whether of naval officers and the Admiralty in 1797 or against poverty and political repression in post-1815 England or Scotland, or even in early colonial Australia against bonded degradation on a remote penal station. As our erstwhile guide to these brotherhoods of oppression and suffering, Ian is of course leading us back to the party of men who raised the cry for death or liberty on the banks of the Wilson River on the 4th of June 1825. As a group, he argues that they exhibit those unifying features and effects intensely, albeit in miniature. The Irishman Michael Clancy, who was the first to raise the cry, was shot dead in the bush, as was the dashing Captain Brown, where one presumes their bodies remained, as neither is recorded in the Port Macquarie winding sheet. Their involvement in the outbreak effectively ended with the erasure of their historical agency, as well as their lives. The authorities would downplay their leadership roles because there was no punitive mileage to be gained from the exploits of dead rebels. Those who survived to stand trial were John Banks, Thomas Brooks, and John Gough. The young David Charlton, who had joined them in the cry for liberty or death, later brought his liberty by turning approver, effectively dogged them in. Banks was an Englishman tried in Stafford, and one guesses Charlton was also English. He, of course, is the intended focus of the unwritten section on the language of betrayal that Ian had in his original manuscript. John Gough was a naval seaman and was a so-called mulatto. So he was born on the Isle of Wight, but seems to have had a black mother. Thomas Brooks was born in Yorkshire. His childhood and youth was spent in poverty-stricken North Country. He came from a family of handloom weavers, a dying trade he inherited and languished in. The three others who joined that cry for death or liberty were William Walsh, Patrick Wheelerham, presumably both Irishman, and John Rowan, whose oddly spelled name offers few clues as to his identity. This paper was drafted in a pre-digital world, and it's impossible not to reflect how easily Ian could have settled these questions of origin and ethnicity had he had access to a relational database. Thus we arrive at a death or liberty gang with a significantly Irish component and an English informer. However, the officially designated ringleaders, one was a black man from England, a man in English society, but not precisely of it, and the other two were unambiguously English. And as Ian points out, this surely challenges any notion that the English convicts invariably avoided outright conflict with colonial authority and cowered behind the Irish in shadowy compliance. What most defines our 8 death or liberty men at Macquarie Harbour, argues Ian, is not nationality or skin colour, but they possess a shared hidden transcript and a common enemy. They were not just transported prisoners, but also further degraded to the worst a penal colony could offer, short of hanging, a penal station. Gough and Brooks had already amassed considerable experience of penal stations and absconding from them. Gough in particular was a marked man, quite literally, for by December 1824, the Sydney Police Office reported that John Gough had already received upwards of 2,000 lashes. Sorry, I just had to pause there. I know too much about flogging. And just the thought of 2,000, it takes an hour to inflict 100 lashes. It's just horrendous. And that would rise to over 3,000 lashes before he was hung in 1827. Both men came from sections of England's population that invariably featured in the subversive and ultra-radical movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Brooks as a degraded artisan in a declining trade, and Gough as a wartime seaman and a black man. Thus, it's not insignificant that the band included Irish, English, and an English-born member of the far-flung African diaspora created by the Atlantic slave trade. Such mixtures were combustible in proximity to jointly perceived oppressive authority, and so it proved in 1825, when the convicts raised their defiant cry and sparked a bushfire on the banks of the Wilson River. It was a significant event of dramatic collective resistance, yet it has slipped from historical memory. To slightly misquote the French historian Arlette Farage, there is no need to condemn our death or liberty gang to a second death, buried deep in the archives. For thanks to Ian's careful excavation, we can restore their historical agency and ensure their digital afterlife. And one of the things that I really like about the digital work that's been conducted in Australia is one of the many things it can do is act as a memorial for past peoples. Thank you very much.